get settled. We're going to start in just a minute. It takes a few minutes to let over 200 people into a Zoom meeting. Give us just a moment.
Oh, good. Okay, good.
And some of you aren't muted, and maybe you want to be muted for this. And I'm just going to give it one more minute and then we'll start. And I do want to let people know that we are recording this. So if you have friends and neighbors who want to see this after the fact, if your Friday or Saturday night would involve listening to a census update, you get that opportunity. Okay, Christy, if you give me the go ahead, I will just nod your head and I'll just jump right in. Okay. All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming. I do notice that in the virtual world, people tend to be more on time than they are in the real world. So we will try to be respectful of that for you all. We have quite a full agenda today. We have multiple moving parts. So sit tight. First thing I might ask is that if you aren't muted, go ahead and mute yourself unless you have a speaking role. We do hear somebody in the background. All right. So here's the lineup. First, we're going to hear from Susan Frederick, who is Senior Federal Counsel in the NCSL DC office. She's going to talk a little bit about HR1. Then we're going to go over to James. Many of you know James Whitehorn from the Census Bureau. He'll tell us what's the latest news. I don't think there's any late breaking news today. I don't think we're going to have something that makes the news today. He's shaking his head. And then we will talk with Frank Strigari from Ohio a little bit about the census delays and what does it mean for redistricting. And then we have speakers from 4 different states lined up to share with you what those states are doing. And I know that there are more ways to skin this cat than just those 4. So if you all have some plans or thoughts about plans in your state, I absolutely want to hear them. If you want to raise your hand now saying you want to talk about your state, let me know. That would be great. We'll obviously give you the chance afterwards, after we hear from the 4 people who are going to share their state plans with us. So with that, Susan, please tell us about HR1. What is it? Why should we care?
Thank you, Wendy, and welcome everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. So happy you can join us this afternoon. As you probably have all seen by now, HR1, which is the For the People Act of 2021, has passed the House of Representatives and is making its way over to the Senate. There will be a hearing on the Senate side later in the month. They are on the Senate side, they're going to draft their own bill. It's probably going to look a lot like HR1, which is a very broad and expansive look at reforms having to do with elections administration. There is a massive chunk that deals with redistricting, which would be applicable for this redistricting cycle. So I want to make you aware of that. And with that being the case, I think a lot of the conditions that are in the bill that deal with redistricting are not going to be able to be implemented at the state level, given the tight time frame. If you want to reach out to me with any questions or for details about the bill, I'm available. We've sent a memo over to Senate staff kind of outlining our concerns with the redistricting provisions. Happy to go through that with you, but given our tight timeline today, I'm going to defer. And, just send me a note or send Wendy a note. Happy to discuss that with you further. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Wendy to move on. Just wanted to red flag that for you. One other piece I will add is that I know that the House Republicans and the Senate Republicans are working on a counter proposal to HR1. It would look more like the way the Help America Vote Act is structured, with some broad requirements, but leaving implementation of those requirements to the states.
I wonder if anybody does want to unmute themselves and ask anything about HR1 before we move on to the main show. Susan, you were the warm-up act today. I'm going to just say some words for about 30 seconds to give people an opportunity if they do want to say something. It's fine if you don't. No need to speak. Okay.
Or feel free to put a question in the chat and I can respond
I have
in the chat
question.
as well.
Okay.
And State Senator Kathleen Taylor from Oregon.
I just was curious if you could go back to just clarifying a little bit about implementation deadlines I mean, obviously I saw the HR one, but I haven't had a chance to look at it in detail. Can you please clarify for us what's being discussed regarding for redistricting about implementation deadlines, please?
Well, there's requirements of establishing an independent commission and a commission within the state legislative branch. There are public hearing requirements and data accessibility requirements that would be applicable in this redistricting cycle. Given the delay of the data from the Bureau, to later in the summer and into the fall, the implementation, having this apply to 2020, the cycle here is not going to be feasible in many states.
And that's a question that was in the chat box about whether this was for 2030 or 2020. I believe Susan's just shared with you that having it be applicable this decade is mighty hard. I think then I don't see other questions in chat, so I'm going to move to James. For those of you who don't know James, he is the chief of the Census Bureau's Redistricting and Voting Rights Data Office. And he's held that position for a number of years, and he has been at every NCSL convening in probably a full decade, and we really appreciate that. We work very closely together, and he works on behalf of the redistrictors when he's in the internal discussions at the Census Bureau talking about whatever might be going on. He speaks for us. James, take it away. And feel free to take the screen if you want to.
All right. Thanks, Wendy. Let me just get this up here. And so I do want to thank you and NCSL because we've had this great partnership, and I do feel like we've been having these conversations all along the way, which really helps me to understand the needs of redistrictors so that I can represent them well inside the Bureau. And it also helps us make sure that our redistricting data program is being more responsive to the states and the states' needs, because that's really what its purpose is for. I was just going to start today. I've used this slide several times, but I think it's very helpful to remind folks that the census does have two major data products that are going to be coming up for release, and I wanted to be able to emphasize the newest piece of news about them. But the first thing is that the apportionment counts that come out first are state-only population numbers. It's the resident population and the federally affiliated count overseas. It's the numbers as enumerated in the census. So there's no disclosure avoidance applied to it beyond the aggregation to the state level, and it's a total population only number. And the Census Bureau is planning to release those by April 30th of 2021. The redistricting data, that's that granular data that you all need to be able to do your work with redistricting. So that's what gives us the full set of geography from the state down to the census block, that little tiny piece of geographic area that locks together like the Legos of and allows you to build any other geography. This has the resident population only, but it has the characteristics that you need, the race, ethnicity, and some selected housing characteristics that you need to be able to ensure you're complying with both the Voting Rights Act and your own state statutes around those types of criteria. This will have differential privacy applied this decade. That's the disclosure avoidance technique that's been adopted by the Census Bureau for the 2020 census. Specifically, the top-down algorithm is the piece of the differential privacy that's going to be used for this. And the Census Bureau announced on February 12th that we expect to be able to produce these data by September 30th of 2021. And so I think the main reason why Wendy wanted me to kind of lead off today's talk was the question keeps coming up, well, what's going on between now and then? Why does it take until then to create this data for the states to use? And to understand why it's going to take us till the end of September, you have to look at the production pipeline. You start with preparing the apportionment counts. In a very broad sense, the Census Bureau starts by assembling and standardizing all of the census responses. They come in through a series of different channels and programs. People could submit by paper, by telephone, by internet. But then in addition to those responses, we also take in responses through other programs, ones that we conduct to make sure that we're getting that full accurate count that people rely on. There's the group quarters program, there's the enumeration of transitory locations, there's non-response follow-up, and there are others as well. Once we have all of those responses assembled, they have to be standardized. They have to be linked to our master address file. Once we do that, the next step is to resolve any duplicates. And this has to be done with the full national data set prepared so that we can capture people who may have been duplicated across state lines. The work on this for the 2020 census also requires additional effort due to the large number of census responses that didn't use a census provided ID this decade. Allowing non-response ID was an intentional design choice to make it easier for people to respond anytime, anywhere, especially now that we have this internet instrument. But it does require more back-end work on our part to make sure that we count everyone once, only once, and in the right place. And then finally, we fill in missing count information for households using a statistical method called imputation. And that's all the activities that it takes to get us to apportionment. So that's getting us to those state population totals that we need for calculating or for providing those apportionment totals that allow for the calculation of the number of seats that go to each state in Congress. So once that is complete, because we need the output from that apportionment process to bring in to the redistricting data processing cycle. In this decade, we prioritized the work necessary to reach apportionment by delaying some of the processing that we would have been able to do in tandem that allows us to get the detailed geographic characteristic data that you need for the redistricting file. The processing delays mean that we have to return to that processing flow to ensure that each response is not only identified at the state level, but all the way down to that individual census block that I mentioned. Once that work is done and we have the data linked to our administrative records universe, we can then pick back up on what would be considered our traditional response processing for redistricting data at that point. The next step is ensuring that each and every record in the entire census has a complete set of data for the major characteristics, and that those characteristics contain valid responses. Missing data is imputed again, and invalid responses are edited. And when I say missing data, that's somewhat explanatory. It means that there was not a response to a specific question on the form. But an invalid response is a situation like a birth date being 1970 and the age being reported as 5 years old. That has to be resolved. And so that's a very simple example, but this is actually one of the most complex parts of the processing that takes place. And it's critical, it's absolutely critical to the accuracy of those characteristics. So once we complete that process, we have to protect the data from unintentional disclosure. And the physical act of that doesn't take a great deal of time, but since this is our first census using that modernized technique of differential privacy that I mentioned, we're taking some time here to be very deliberate and ensure that it's being applied as we've designed it. Once we have the protected data, we finally have something that we can tabulate, but we have to process all that data through our tabulation system, output that data into multiple formats that are the ones that are needed for all the different dissemination paths. We check all those data in their tabulated formats. Then we have to create the dissemination materials. We have to load our web-based systems. We have to test the materials and the systems to make sure they're working and they're providing the data back out to people properly. And that's when we can finally deliver this data to the states and the public. But in keeping with the theme of today's discussion, though, I wanted to talk a little bit about what kind of data is already available that states could be using to help in their work. So the official 2020 Census Redistricting Geographic Support products have already been provided to all states in the country. We were able to do that by February 12th of 2021. We started in January 22nd of 2021. And that includes the shape files, which are those geographic information system files that allow you to do the computerized cartography and manipulation that you need to do to create redistricting plans, especially if you're doing so at a state level. We have PDF-based maps. We have block maps, which show a series of maps for every county in the country that show enough detail that you can identify every single block that is in those counties. But then we also have state legislative district maps with voting districts on them. We have tract-based maps, and we have school district-based maps. So we have a whole slew of maps that were produced, and these are all PDF formats. You can print them off on a large format printer or a plotter. And then there's tabular data. These are listings of all the blocks within a state for different types of geographies that you can pull in to sort of build a back-end database and have that prepared in advance of receipt of the actual count data. I'll make sure that Christy and Wendy get these slides so that they can distribute them back out, because I put a lot of links in here to make things easier for folks. If you need access to those official 2020 Census geographic products, the link is right there. We also have something called prototype redistricting data. From our 2018 end-to-end census test, we created the geography and the tabulations that people would need. Now, of course, we already have the official geography out, but if you want to see or work with some official or official looking data, you can look at the data products that were produced for that test, that prototype test. That data has the content and the schema and the format that you will receive when you receive your 2020 data. So that's also available on the web. We also, this is more specifically for those states who have an obligation to move folks around, whether it's prisoners or military or students, if they have to move them and adjust their redistricting data prior to conducting their redistricting, we have a census geocounting service. This is something that's always available. It's accessible through the web, through the census website. You can geocode up to 10,000 addresses through the website. But to help states, knowing that they may have a larger population that they have to adjust, we're allowing them to send us their address list as long as they pre-format it. They can send us that address list through a secure incoming web module that we have. We'll run it against the same geocoder, but on the inside of the Census Bureau, so you're not dealing with TCP/IP issues, and we can do that up to 50,000 people. And so we will do that and return that file. Now I say the state is responsible for formatting that data so that it can properly be ingested by the geocoder. We have to be very careful here. When we developed this process, we worked with our legal department to make sure that these addresses didn't accidentally become Title 13, which would mean we wouldn't be able to share them back. So we can't manipulate them for you, but we can take them in if you put them in the format that's indicated on the linked website here at the bottom, and we can run that at a larger scale than what you can do if you're doing it yourself over the web. And if you have questions about that, because I know this is only a subset of states, feel free to just contact my office and we can walk you through that. But I also want to talk about other census data that's out there and some of its strengths and weaknesses. We have the American Community Survey one-year estimates. This is the companion to the decennial census. This replaced the long form, and it's now releases new data every year. So the one-year survey, American Community Survey one-year estimates, is very current data. This was data that was collected in 2019. It's the most current one that's released. But the limitation with that is it only provides data for states, DC and Puerto Rico, congressional districts, and then all cities and counties that have a population threshold of 65,000 or more. So for those areas, you can get a fairly current estimate of the population. The American Community Survey 5-year estimates is sort of the flip of that. You get the geographic specificity. This goes all the way down to the block group, not the block, but the block group, which is an accumulation of blocks. But it's collected over a series of 5 years so that we have enough data to be able to produce statistics at that level. So this will give you better coverage, but it isn't quite as current because it's averaging years 2015 to 2019. And there's more information about these products as well on the links that I've provided right there. There's also something called the Census Population Estimates. This is an estimate of population where it's done through demographic change, births, deaths, migration. And the Census Bureau publishes this, will be publishing reference to 2020 new population estimates this summer in May and June. In May, it'll be more of total population for different geographies. And then in June, it'll be for select geographies, there'll be some population with characteristics as well. So this will give you things like your nation state, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, but it'll give you county and city and township data. And with the county level data, you'll actually get characteristics. City, you'll only get total population. And I believe township, you get characteristics as well with the June release. But so this can give people an idea of some very current estimates of population numbers for these areas and this summer that they could use to sort of look ahead as they plan their redistricting. And links to the schedule and description of the program and the data sets are also available here. My office tries to make this stuff very easy for you to access. As you saw, all those links are there, and I'll make sure that that goes out to NCSL so they can distribute it however they choose. But my office, for most of this, is very simple, census.gov/RDO. The prototype data is under this bottom link you see here, Redistricting Data Program Management. All those official geographic files that I talked about are all under this decennial census, PL 94-171 redistricting age summary files. And then on the left, you'll always see this gray bar, which will have a voting rights link in there. And that'll take you to where we also have our Section 203 and our citizen voting age population by race and ethnicity that we produce every year from the American Community Survey. And since I know there's a lot of folks on deck, I'll just stop right there. I'll leave that up for a second, but then please feel free to contact me if you need any help with any of those things.
And thank you very much, James. I'm always struck by how you and I have a phone call in advance, and then the thing that we sort of hashed out that seemed pretty nebulous comes into being. So I really appreciate you looking at those extra data sources. So I've got one question for you, and then we've got at least two from the audience. And the first one is, how many people are in your office? When you talk about being able to be in touch and people should call you, that's a whole lot of calls, perhaps.
Yeah, so the peak of the redistricting data office were 6 employees. Right now we're down to 4, and then in the off years we'll be down to 3. So we do, my predecessor used to always say, it's the best bang for the buck at the Census Bureau, because we do a lot with few people.
That's pretty impressive. That's pretty impressive. Representative Gatos, would you like to come on and ask your question?
Yeah, sure. It's just kind of curious. I have universities in my district, and I guess what is the process that you reconcile how higher ed students are counted, particularly when you have parents who submit for their kids who have driver's license at home, and then the university submits, like, how is that counted? Because obviously, you know, it has an impact in the community because the university is there, but yet those kids might be living out of state, you know, the rest of the year. How is that balanced or reconciled?
Well, so the census residence rules, situations and criteria, which describe all these different living situations that people could be in. One is obviously university students, and they say that university students should be counted at the university. So I know there's been a lot of conversation around this because of the timing when Census opened self-response was right about when many universities shut down and sent students home because they were concerned about the COVID-19 pandemic. So the Census Bureau did it's not an area where I'm an expert. I know a little bit about it, but I know that we did extensive outreach to the universities to get as much information as they were willing to provide about off-student campus housing. We put in marketing campaigns that specifically targeted college students to let them know that they should be counted at the university. We also did a lot. We prioritized in our coverage follow-up, where we do phone calls for people who have marked on a form that they have someone on their form that has a usual home elsewhere. So like if a parent put their student on the form and they said they usually live somewhere else, we would call up to find out about that so that we could then use that as part of our deduplication process, because what we want to do is make sure we're counting everyone in the right place. And so we also look to see if we have a return for someone at the university, also on another form with someone else in someone else's household. And so then we can look at that and make sure that we pull them out of the location in which they're not supposed to be and keep them in the location where they're supposed to be. So there's a lot of different intricate things that go on back there. But the goal is to get everyone who's living at the university to be counted at the university.
Okay, thank you.
Indeed. So Shelley has a question for you, James. Will the census population estimates in the summer use the pop totals from the 2020 census counts released in April? You may have just answered that, and if so, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's right. The population estimates do not come from the decennial census. They are an independent creation. I believe they get sort of level set as the decennial numbers come out for each decade, but it's not another area I'm an expert in, but I do know that they tend to be highly accurate. They're the numbers that are often used for funding formulas, so that the funding formulas can keep up with annual changes in population. So they are a good source for data.
Excellent. And then here's your next question, and we're only going to do 2 more, and then we'll move on to the other parts. I've heard several people raise concerns with differential privacy in regards to compliance with the VRA and with in regard to reassigning prisoners in states that seek to place them in the locations where they previously lived. Can you respond to those concerns? They're saying the differential privacy application will make these steps impossible. Again, prisoners and VRA.
Well, those concerns have been raised to the Census Bureau. They were raised early. They've been raised frequently. And we've been working very hard to adapt the differential privacy mechanism to ensure that the data will be fit for use when it's produced. We are doing some accuracy tuning based on the redistricting use case, which typically involves the proportion of the the largest race groups within any given area. The problem with a redistricting use case is you can't predefine the area, so you have to make this applicable to any sort of assemblage of blocks. So we're tuning that down to around a 500 person threshold, where we can say that within 95% certainty that those values are within a 5-point range. I may not be saying that quite right. I'm sure our chief scientist could say it with a little more scientific authority, but that's around what we're doing. So the point I'm trying to get across is there is extensive work going along right now. We're running hundreds and hundreds of experiments of different applications of setting the privacy loss budget and how it should be applied to the different queries which produce these different data sets. And we are sensitive to those concerns, and we are working to make sure that the data is tuned in such a way that you still get the data is still protected, but you're getting data that will allow you to use it for those purposes.
Thank you. And the next and last question before we move on comes from Cynthia Dye, who most of you or some of you might know was one of the commissioners in California in the most recent decade. And she also worked on the front lines of the census this year. So she says, I was part of the non-response follow-up operation, which is the door knocking for any of you who aren't following that part. And at the end, she was told that all what was needed were the total population with no characteristics. We were told not to bother interviewing in many cases. So the question for you, James, is how do you impute this missing data?
Yeah, I can't comment on the guidance that she was given, but I know that when we have something like a total count, we use a series of administrative records. They can be from the IRS, they can be from Social Security. We use the past decennial census as another source of administrative records, and all of that goes into that editing and imputation process that I mentioned during the description of the path that takes us to census. The one that I was saying is the most complex and involved, is they pull in all of those other resources, and they can look at similarities between like households based on the characteristics that are reported, based on geographic proximity. So there's many different feeds that come into that process, and through the decades and through the experts at the Census Bureau who work with this type of data, they've been able to come up with a method that does fill in those gaps.
Great, thank you. All right, and James, indeed, thank you for making yourself available to us today and always. If you wouldn't mind putting your email in the chat. Again, I hope you aren't being inundated, but you sort of opened yourself up for that because you are a service-oriented person, so we very much appreciate it. Frank, I'm coming to you in just a moment. You're going to kind of lead off with what is the way that states can respond to these census delays? Why is this a problem for redistricting that may be difficult for the states to manage? Can you take it with just that little bit of a question?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Wendy. For all of you who don't know me, my name's Frank Strigari. Yes, my name's Frank Strigari. I'm the Chief Legal Counsel for the Ohio Senate. Also Vice Chair of the NCSL Redistricting and Elections Committee. So it's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. I was joking with Wendy and the gang earlier a little bit. I didn't know if I was going to be allowed to be in here since the state of Ohio is involved with something going on with the Census Bureau right now. But not only was I allowed in, I was actually able to go right after James. So it's a little, call it irony. I don't know. Anyway, so Wendy had asked me to talk about the challenges that states might be posed with. Ohio obviously is one of those states that has a challenge in front of it that we will be that's posed to us, and we will have to figure out. And I'll get a little bit into that in just a bit, and talk about some other ideas before the group that is actually most informative. It will be coming up after me, which is actually talking about specifics for what they're doing. I'm sure all of you have probably gotten the emails and have probably looked at the website already, but NCSL has got a rather extensive amount of information about this already online, which I would obviously suggest that everyone go to. It's got, the 5 sort of best practices that NCSL at least is recommending as ideas on how to address this issue. And namely, they're changing the law, going to court, looking at changing your deadlines, using different type of data, or complementing your process with a different type of law. Now, some of those may be helpful to some states, some of those might not be helpful at all, or they might not be practical at all. Some might have constitutional deadlines like Ohio does, versus statutory deadlines that can be changed easier than a constitutional amendment, or, they just might have to just supplement, a practice that their state has in particular. But the website's got some pretty informative information that I would suggest all of you go to. And then, of course, there's a rather large wealth of information related to other issues as well, too, which I always recommend. So the interesting thing that the way that my head has at least evolved in this process over time recently is I think it's probably not really surprising, is that this is a bipartisan problem. This isn't a Republican problem. This isn't a Democrat problem. In the beginning, some people may have suggested, probably including myself to some degree, that it seemed to be some level of maybe political actions going on here. But as I thought about it and talked about it with people, it's affecting Republican states just as much as it's affecting Democrat states. So it's a problem for everyone, and hopefully it's not a significant problem for folks, but it's definitely a problem that we can all blame James for. Sorry, James. But there are different ways to address it. Like I said, there's NCSL has got some suggestions, and I think ultimately none of us probably on this call really probably want to even see this issue go to any court whatsoever, because courts probably don't want to even hear it as well. They don't have to deal with it. They know how much of an issue this is as well too. But sometimes that might be the only relief that might be necessary to get. And California is one of those examples, and I think we're going to hear from somebody from California later to talk a little bit more about what they've done and what they might still need to have to do. But obviously, I think everyone probably wants to avoid courts, and being a lawyer like myself, I think that's something that we're going to try to do, hopefully. But in Ohio in particular, we are a state that has a constitutional deadline for not only congressional, but legislative redistricting. And as I'm sure, those of you who have been on these calls before, you probably heard me talk a lot about Ohio, because obviously that's my state. But we did reform for both congressional and legislative redistricting in the past 10 years that I think was pretty significant, and in some ways maybe started the process of other states doing that. One of the things we did, though, of course, was constitutionalize a deadline for redistricting. And the issue that the census delay is posing for us right now is our legislative maps are the final deadline for those is September the 15th. And obviously, if we're getting any type of data we're supposed to be getting, from the census is coming September the 30th. We obviously aren't going to have the data we're going to need to draw our lines and get everything and get all the population data that we need. So we are having internal conversations. We've been having those for a while, because I think we sort of saw the writing on the wall to some extent for a good amount of time now about what to do. There is a provision in our Constitution that allows us to look at other data if the Census Bureau decennial information is actually unavailable. That language actually has been in the Ohio Constitution for over 100 years, has never been used from what we've seen so far. And so we are in fertile new territory in Ohio as we speak, and are evaluating all of our options. There's no answer on the table right now for us. We're looking at a lot of different ideas. Fortunately, the deadline as it relates to congressional redistricting in our Constitution is November the 30th. There's a series of deadlines before then related to congressional redistricting, but the real true drop dead deadline in the Constitution for us is November the 30th. So it appears like, hopefully it appears that we'll probably be fine with getting something done and finalized for congressional, but legislative redistricting is a significant problem for us. And I'm confident that we're going to come up with a solution. I think I'm pretty confident that we'll come up with a bipartisan solution, but it's going to take some thought process. And that's why I think even myself was actually interested in hearing how some of the other states are handling it. And, and I guess probably the last thing to talk about in particular is I think the thing that I let off my joke with, but so I'm sure you probably all have seen the Attorney General in the state of Ohio, on behalf of the state of Ohio, filed a lawsuit in federal court, I think at the beginning of last week, against the Census Bureau, and effectively, I think seeking a mandamus to, force the Census Bureau to give us the information. I have to obviously give the disclaimer here. The General Assembly in Ohio was not involved in that lawsuit. We still are not involved in that lawsuit. It's something that the Attorney General, of course, took upon himself. It's a very novel question. We are just as much as eager to see how this case might get resolved as probably all of you are. We do have questions. We're not sure. What the remedy could be, what the remedy might be, what the real sort of resolution to this could be, because the ultimate question comes down to, if we get access to data, is it accurate data? And if it's not, I'm not really sure that there's not much we could probably do with data that's not finalized and accurate. But our Attorney General is a very experienced and very savvy lawyer. And he's got a lot of people on his staff that are too. So, I'll be curious to see how that goes, just as much as you are. And, but that, Ohio, of course, as always breaks news, but that's the news that we broke recently. So we'll see how that happens. But anyway, so just to summarize, Ohio, like the upcoming states here, all have a challenge in front of it. There are options on the table. We are trying to figure out what the best option is. I'm pretty confident that we will, but I think having this forum to talk about the options and hear what other people are doing in other states is extremely helpful. And it's a pleasure to be here as always. And thank you, Wendy, for having me. And I am going to be an attentive audience member from here on. So.
Thank you very much, Frank. One thing you point out to me with your comments about the AG is that there's nothing that's the state of Ohio did such and such. It's some entity within the state of Ohio did such and such. And those entities may even have the same party label, but that does not mean they all speak with one voice. So thanks for bringing that reminder to us. I do have to say that at the beginning of what you were talking about, you said that NCSL has put out best practices, and my little heart went, oh no, because if my boss were on the line, I would be in deep trouble if she thought I was peddling best practices. What we've tried to do is gather whatever we could find from the states on how they are handling this. And so we're sharing what we're hearing more so than sharing ideas about how states should do it. So just want to be clear. So in case that my boss listens to this after the fact, she'll know that I'm not telling states how to do state business. Okay, we do have 4 more speakers lined up from 4 different states, each that has chosen a different approach. We're going to start with Robin Johansson is, I think, how it's pronounced. She is a partner with Olson Remcho, and I've probably messed that up as well. She'll help us get that cleaned up. She's from California, and she was the attorney who handled the California request to the state Supreme Court to give relief in advance on the deadlines they have. But Robin, that was the lousiest introduction ever. I hope you'll forgive me and come on and tell us what's going on in California.
It was a great introduction, Wendy. Thank you. We have represented the California legislature for many years on redistricting. As many of you know, California now has an independent redistricting commission that did the redistricting in 2010 for the first time. I want to say thank you to Commissioner Dye for being on the program. It's great to have you here. So the legislature is no longer in charge of redistricting, but we do have a very important role under the initiative that set up our independent redistricting commission, and that is to provide the database. And with the problems with the census, as you can imagine, that has made it difficult for California and for the legislature. So what we did very early on, back in July, was to realize that with the delay in the census that was supposed to be just until the end of July, our redistricting commission had a constitutional deadline of August 15th, and it could not even possibly meet that deadline. So that it also had early July deadlines that are in the statute for release of draft maps. And we realized again that that was not going to work. The only way that we could deal, we felt, with that constitutional deadline was to go directly to the California Supreme Court and ask for relief. There just wasn't another possibility. And we felt it was important to do it last year, a full year in advance or even more, because of the need. If we were going to have to get a constitutional amendment on the ballot, we'd have to do it in November of 2020. So we kind of did a Hail Mary pass and asked the California Supreme Court to issue a ruling, which they did, giving us a 4-month extension of time. And it was interesting to set up the lawsuit. Again, going directly to the California Supreme Court is no easy task. They take very few cases. They, of course, don't particularly like to have things filed directly with them. And in addition, we weren't sure about how we were going to have a case or controversy because we weren't sure, who might oppose it. As it turned out, nobody did. But we sued the Secretary of State in his official capacity, asked for an order that he would accept the districting, the maps, the final maps, after the August 15th deadline. And at that point, the new commission had not yet been seated. So while the previous commission remained in place, we thought it would be difficult for them and wanted to let them decide whether they wanted to participate or not. As it was, the Supreme Court issued an order just a few days after we filed, inviting the commission in, and they came in and agreed with us that we needed to get more time. There really was no opposition, and we had one amicus brief that was filed asking for a slightly different remedy. But as it was, the Supreme Court issued its ruling on July 17th. I think we had filed, when did I have that down? We had filed, I think, on July 1. So within about a little over 2 weeks, we were able to get that kind of ruling. The ruling was to give the commission another 4 months until December 15th, because that was going to be the delay, or longer, depending on how long the delay extended, if that was necessary. And so that's what we're up against now. And I cannot speak for the commission, of course. They, I'm sure, are looking at all kinds of other remedies if they can. I think the best I can say at this point is that, it's a little bit like looking under the cushions for loose change. Everyone is trying to find a few days here, a few days, there in the election calendar, and figuring out best ways that we could perhaps shorten the time period, for example, of getting the database pulled together, for example, of the various filing deadlines and things like that. But at this point, there, just as Frank said, there hasn't been any resolution. So Wendy, with that, I'm happy to take questions, but I can say, I guess the other thing I should say is that we do have a June primary, and our first election deadline on the June primary is December 15th. So that's going to be a problem.
Okay, that's December 15th is, I don't know how you're going to do that, because the local election officials have to take that data and make sure that the voters are assigned to the right precincts. Maybe they even have to create some new precincts. So are the local election officials talking to you in California about how are they going to do their job? Everyone is, okay.
Everyone is talking, Wendy. And the other thing, of course, that it's not just the local election officials, but it's the local jurisdictions. Our cities and our counties all have to redistrict as well. So we're hearing from everybody. And a lot of these cities or counties have charters that give them deadlines, and they're trying to figure out how to handle those.
So this is like taking the water that comes off of the Continental Divide and it runs down to the Platte River and onto the Mississippi and then down outward. There's always somebody downriver on this issue. We do have a question from Jerry Berry. Doesn't a 4 or 6 month extension play havoc with your 2022 election calendar? And you're sort of talking about that. Is there any conversation about changing when the primary would be or what the candidate filing deadlines would be?
Well, those issues are definitely being looked at. And I just, I can't speak to,
Where it'll go.
Where it will end up, but every possible remedy is I'm sure being discussed by someone.
Great. I would so much appreciate, Robin, that you came on board for us, and I hope you'll stay with us. Jason, I'm coming to you next. We have Jason Hancock from Idaho. He is the Deputy Secretary of State and also the State Election Director. And I believe you've had a role at the legislature too. Would you answer that and then tell us what the Idaho approach to the delays will be?
Thank you very much. You bet. Yeah, so my background is I've worked for 2 different nonpartisan legislative staffs in 2 different states. Was a budget and policy analyst for Legislative Services Office here in Idaho for a number of years. Then went to the Department of Education as the deputy chief over there. While I was there, I actually staffed half of the Redistricting Commission in 2011. We have a commission here in Idaho. And then the last 6 years, I was in South Dakota as the Legislative Research Council director. So nonpartisan staff in South Dakota, and just came back to Idaho last April. So, having had some background with this in 2011, and now being in the Secretary of State's office over the elections area, we have some formal involvement in this process, but not necessarily historically a very substantive involvement in this process. The Redistricting Commission that we have here is a bipartisan commission. It's a 6-member commission. It's appointed by the Speaker of the House, the Pro Tem of the Senate, the 2 minority leaders, and the 2 state party chairs. So it's 3-3. And so, they have 90 days to do their work once they get formed. Normally they would do that over the summer, but obviously with these delays, it's not going to be able to start till fall, which gets us into some pretty tight timeframes, especially since there is always a lawsuit over the plan. And so you kind of have to build in some time for that too. So, we had some discussions with the census, and they were good enough to say that they were going to be able to provide the census population estimates from 2020 to us. It sounds like normally they like to have that come out kind of simultaneous with the actual census, because there's maybe some cross-pollination that goes on there, but they're going to go ahead and push that out at the beginning of May so that we will know the census estimates, at least, of what the county population numbers are for each of our counties from July of 2020. And that's important because Idaho is one of those states that has a really strong provision in its state constitution saying that when you do redistricting, you cannot divide any more counties than you have to in order to make a map work. And so it really puts us in a position where, there's only going to be a certain number of different ways you can put that puzzle together and minimize the number of counties that get split. Obviously, some counties have to be split because there's too many people in them. So they're going to have to be divided into multiple districts. But what we've kind of taken the initiative of doing here with the Secretary of State's office is we've spoken with each of those appointing authorities. And once we get those county estimates in May, I'll get to work on figuring out what are all of the possible iterations of how you can kind of put those county puzzle pieces together in a way that gets you to the minimum number of counties being split. And my experience with the Redistricting Commission from 2011 was that, you know, that ends up being about half of the argument with that group, is kind of how to put those puzzle pieces together. And then the other half is just how you split up the counties that you have to split. And so, you know, our idea here is that, you know, once we figured out all the different iterations of how you can put the counties together and which counties have to be split, that we will take those different iterations of maps to the 6 appointing authorities, and then the 6 of them can start to talk about, you know, what's acceptable and what's not. And they can do whatever it is that they do as far as horse trading goes, because, you know, presumably if that group of 6 appointing authorities can come together and agree on how to put the different counties together, then, you know, presumably their 6 appointees will also be agreeable with that plan. And then they can just move straight onto the work of figuring out how to divide the counties that need to be divided, because we won't be able to do that work until we get the actual census data at the end of September. So we're hoping to kind of squeeze down how much time the Redistricting Commission is going to have to take by sort of pre-agreeing on a plan for how to put the different counties together, and hopefully save us enough time that we're able to deal with the inevitable lawsuit that we'll have.
You have made that point not once but twice, that you can expect to have lawsuits. So I think that's true in Idaho, and it's true in almost all the other states. So thanks for that. So what we've got now is California went to the Supreme Court and in their own state and asked for relief, and they still have a tough timeline. In Idaho, they're going to use some data that's less precise than the actual decennial census, try to get it as close as they can, and then take another shot at it afterwards. Thank you.
Yeah.
Jeff, I'm going to call on you next from New York. Jeff wears many hats. The hat I want to offer for him or highlight today is that he is with Frank, co-chairs of our Redistricting Election Standing Committee here at NCSL. We were expecting Assemblymember Rodriguez to be with us today, but he was not able to join us. Jeff, come on board and tell us the New York approach to this. Jeff, are you there? Okay, I don't know where Jeff is, so we will move on. And that means Representative Bratcher, you are up.
I'm here.
Okay, good.
I'm on mute. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Well, I do bring regrets from Assemblyman Robert Rodriguez, who had planned to be here, but the New York Legislature is in session this afternoon. I'll try to, since we're running short on time, I'll try to cover 20 minutes in a fast New York minute or two. Last year in New York, we reviewed the census delivery situation caused by the pandemic delay and evaluated it as it affected New York's new redistricting process. Up until 2012, the state legislature enacted redistricting plans through basic changes in state law, subject to the governor's approval. But in 2014, New York voters approved a constitutional amendment that created an independent commission tasked to draw and recommend congressional and state legislative maps that the legislature could then approve, being subject to the governor's approval. And the new commission the new constitutional amendment permits the commission to develop up to 2 separate sets of plans that the legislature can consider before the legislature takes over the process on its own, if that becomes necessary. So the pandemic-related delay is condensing the commission's ability to work with census data from 9 months down to basically 3 months. And that recognizing the commission will have less time to do its work than the state constitution envisioned when it was approved in 2014. The New York voters will consider a constitutional amendment this November that would change the dates, essentially locking in a final January 1st, 2022 deadline for the commission to submit its first set of plans to the legislature, eliminating a current grace period until January 15th. And that if the legislature rejects or the governor vetoes the commission's first set of plans, the legislature, or the commission rather, has until January 15th of next year to submit a second set of plans. Under current law, the commission was given until February 28th. This proposed amendment was approved by the legislature last year, and then again in the new legislature in January. So it will be before the voters this coming November. New York needs to complete its redistricting process by late January of next year, by my estimate, so that the state can proceed with petitioning and qualifying for the June 2022 primary. New York also moved its primary from September to June in 2019. So with the shortened period for redistricting and the earlier primary, then taking into consideration the 2 or 3 weeks probably necessary for boards of elections to implement the plan, it will be for many of us a very busy and fast October through January period. So thank you and good luck as we face the challenges of data and deadlines.
Jeff, that was remarkable. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. It strikes me that in New York, you're starting to move this over into 2022. And is that right?
Well, redistricting, New York was a pre-clearance state under Section 5. So usually New York adopted a plan in the January to March period, usually by March, and then 2 months for DOJ review. So that we had to have a plan in place by essentially May, June at the latest, so that what was then a fall primary, petitioning could begin. But now that the primary is in June, petitioning begins in late February, meaning that the final congressional and state plans need to be enacted, signed by the governor by late January. This is just the best case scenario. Everything is being sped up because the commission should have had from April until December to do its job. Actually, April until February under the original Constitution, but with the primary change and with the pandemic delays, the state constitutional amendment addresses the best, most practical way to deal with everything. However, on a very, very tight time frame, because if the commission's plans are rejected by the legislature, the way things work in most states, you just can't put a bill in. You vote one day, no, have a new plan from the commission the next day. Now it's a very tight January because you need 2-3 days for bills to lay over before you can vote on them. So I've been looking at the different timeframes, and it'll be very tight, hopefully doable.
Well, and I did save Representative Kevin Bratcher from Kentucky for our last speaker, because I think he might bring calm to the conversation. I'm under the impression that Kentucky's deadlines are already in 2022. So it's all about the timelines. Representative Bratcher, are you there? And can you share how you're going to handle it there, bringing calm to the picture?
Yes, Wendy, can you hear me all right?
You sound good.
Great. Well, you're always so gracious and a great host, and I love working with you. Just to jump forward a moment, we had a county law, a statute that is hardwired to December 31st on census operations. And this morning in the General Assembly, we passed the law to change that to have it the wheels start on a certain time date after we receive the census information. So other than that, we always have issues. We don't have big issues in Kentucky because we are not in session from April till January of the next year. And even if the census data was on time, it would be April when Kentucky gets it. And we don't have time to the 02 year. So you're right, it is normal. It's just instead of getting the information in April, we'll be getting it in September, and I'll make our maps and do a normal operation on the 02 year, usually the first 2 weeks. Now, we do have a early filing deadline, and it's the first week of January. So we do have a bill in the works now, before our session ends in a couple of weeks, to move the filing deadline back to the end of January, because the courts would step in if we don't give them if we don't give enough time for a filing deadline. Now, sometimes during the years, the governor would call a special session, like in November or December, and let us clear out a map before the session starts in the 02 year. Late 01, we would have a special session, but we just don't know if that's going to happen at this time. You know, every year, I've been doing this for 24 years, and every time we redraw, it ends up in the Supreme Court, or the courts do speak. Political issues or whatnot. We have a rural versus urban issue. The urban issues are growing, and the rural areas are obviously shrinking in population. And so, you know, if a state rep or a senator has been out in the rural areas for a while, then all of a sudden their districts are going to shrink. So other than that, it's pretty much normal operations, just a few months delay. And I hope that brings the calm that you're looking for. We have things squared away, I'm pretty sure. So.
Well, what I'm liking there, well, I'll respond to you in just a moment, but I do want to say, if anyone in the audience would like to share what's going on in their state, put your hand up and we'll be happy to do that. But what I'm hearing from you is that it's normal, but you've already got one new law that you've introduced because of it for the counties, and another new law coming about the candidate filing deadlines. And of course, these aren't the kinds of laws that make the front page of the paper, but still you are very conscientiously thinking about how the timeline works. So somebody's got their eye on the ball for sure.
Yeah, we're lucky that we don't have, I guess we're lucky. Depends on how you look at it. We don't have constitutional deadlines. Everything is statutory, and we don't have a commission. So it's all to be had from September to January. We should wrap this thing up. Now, that might be famous last words, who knows? But we're wanting to be open and follow all the rules, and the Supreme Court gives us, Kentucky Supreme Court gives us guidelines. We're definitely going to follow those, and NCSL has some tremendous information. We're getting well versed in those aspects too.
Oh, that's super great. And could you just tell us when your primary is?
Our primary is the last Tuesday in May.
Okay, all right. So some of the primaries, the folks who have primaries in March are probably in a little more trouble than those who are May, June, and beyond. Thank you very much for sharing that. And I'm assuming that if anybody wants to talk to you more about it, they can. Now, this is the last chance for the whole audience. If you'd like to share what's going on in your state, please do. But in the meantime, I'd like you to fill that chat box, please, with whether we should have another census update in April. I mean, we've been having them every month for quite some time now. And James keeps coming back, which we so very much appreciate. And I don't know what a month without him would look like. So I'm kind of inclined to do it, but maybe it's not important. So if you all could just throw us some ideas in the chat box or get in touch with us afterward, that would be great. I don't see any hands raised. So with that, I'm going to say a very big thank you to all of our participants today, starting with Susan from our DC office, and James from the census, and Frank from Ohio, and Robin from California, and Jason from Idaho, Jeff from New York, and then you, Representative Bratcher from Kentucky. Thank you all very much, and feel free to be in touch. I think you all know how to get us. We're going to keep going so we can get the answers on our question about the updates, but I think we're done with the meat of this meeting. We learned a lot. Okay, I'm seeing nothing but yeses, so I think that means we will do an April meeting as well. All right, stay safe, stay in touch. Bye-bye.